Despite what I like to believe, liberty is a complex idea. It's been developing over hundreds of years in European and American history, being asserted, challenged, and reformed. Schopenhauer once said that there was no such thing as real liberty, that we were all predestined and determined, not just by our biology, but by our society. Before him, Rousseau said, man is born free, but everywhere he's in chains. This liberty as a theory is tossed around. It morphs depending on the light it's seen in. Sometimes it even folds in on itself and implodes. I want to ask a question that deals with its implosion. Whom do we deprive of liberty for the sake of liberty? Post-colonial studies jumps on this question. Its quintessential example is the domination and colonization of Native American people for the sake of manifest destiny, the taking of liberty for the purpose of saying, give me liberty or give me death. But here, we define liberty as anything that doesn't harm another. In this context, the refrain, so long as it doesn't hurt anyone, comforts us. It excludes the type of blatant domination and colonization that occurred with the Native Americans out of the realm of possibility, or at least it seems to. Foucault traces the history of the penal system, the birth of the prison, in his book, Discipline and Punish. If you're familiar with the text, you know that he reveals the shift from sovereign power, which was theatrical, arbitrary, and violent, most epitomized in the theater of the gallows, to the more naturalized, objective, and systematic power of the panopticon. Although the impetus for this reform came from humanist philosophers, Foucault reveals that the latter did not in actuality become more humanistic. The new organized, objective, and neutral system only became more efficient. But Foucault's analysis of the history of the penal system concerns mostly Western Europe. So what of the development of incarceration in the US specifically? In 2014, Naomi Murakawa published a book entitled The First Civil Right: How Liberals Built Prison America. Unlike many scholars, she does not solely indict conservative Republicans for tough on crime rhetoric. Instead, she traces how the liberal rhetoric throughout the civil rights movement created an environment in which the supposed egalitarian agenda could be easily co-opted and used for repressive, dominating measures. Interestingly, it seems as though the liberal and conservative criminal reforms she traces follow precisely the same exact reasoning of England and France in Foucault's classical period. Namely, they both portray a need to move from arbitrary violence to systematic violence. During the civil rights movement, liberals and conservatives differed on the root cause of what they believed was a crime problem. While conservatives believed that crime was caused by integration, liberals believed that crime occurred due to the United States' history with enslavement, which created a hostile relationship between white and black people. White people then, out of this hostility, would commit arbitrary violence against African Americans, Mexican Americans, and Native Americans. She gives the following example. In the Los Angeles Zoot Suit riots, over 1,000 white people, many of whom were soldiers and sailors, marched through East Los Angeles and assaulted the Zoot Suit hoodlums. A Zoot Suit is something analogous to like a hoodie or baggy pants. Mostly Mexican Americans, white people, many of whom were soldiers and sailors, marched through East Los Angeles and assaulted the Zoot Suit hoodlums, mostly Mexican Americans as well as African and Filipino Americans. White mobs ruled the streets for 10 days. Some attackers stripped victims of their suits and stole their money, but this violence could not in any practical sense be called lawless. Los Angeles police officers followed the white rioters, observed their assaults, and participated in the beatings. Police officers arrested Mexican Americans, and the Los Angeles City Council made it a misdemeanor to wear a zoot suit. This was not only state-sponsored white violence, but more accurately, white violence enabled and administered by the criminal justice system. This type of violence, or white lawlessness, came to be seen in light of World War II and the Cold War as a legitimate threat to state legitimacy. Organizations within the U.S. were indicting the U.S. for the same exact type of racist violence that we were fighting against overseas. To respond to this, liberal law and order advocates distinguished between lawless violence, such as mobs or lynchings, and lawful violence, such as state punishments or execution. Thus, Murakawa writes, when liberal law and order campaigns pursued the right to safety as the first step toward racial equality, they had to build a bigger, better, stronger, and more systematic carceral state in order to pursue that safety. This looked like putting more money into training police officers, increasing the salaries of police officers to attract more qualified candidates, and increasing the systemization of sentencing and more. So despite the fact that white violence enabled and administered by the criminal justice system was the normal thing to do at the time, both conservatives and liberals had a singular faith in the federal government to correct racial ills through better machinery. They both believed that well-administered punishment was necessarily just, that increased law and order would protect racial minorities from white police violence, that a better carceral state would be strong enough to control racial violence in the streets, and regimented enough to control racial bias in the criminal justice system. It was vital that the only option to stop racial crime was to build a better carceral state, because when white police joined white mobs in murdering racially diverse citizens, the lawless violence threatened that legitimacy of the state. The response had to be, it must have been something that would not just eliminate the racial violence, but something that would restore the legitimacy, the neutrality, the objectivity, and the rightfulness of the state. Interestingly, these agendas for race-neutral machinery actually propelled the development of the punitive carceral state. The bigger and better federal carceral machinery was later co-opted, both by conservative and by liberal administrations who needed, in order to get elected, to promote tough-on-crime laws. Because of its supposed neutrality, any state-based racial violence could easily be construed as objective, not racist. For instance, Murakawa outlines how the evolution of narcotics mandatory penalties responded to the racial distribution of narcotics arrestees. To make a lot of data short, I'm just going to say in 1933, narcotics arrests were 67% white and 11% black. These arrests were not treated harshly. By 1950, arrests were 46% white and 50% black. The next year, in 1951, Congress passed a harsh drug-related mandatory minimum sentences. By 1955, arrests were 36% white and 63% black. Congress ratified those minimums in 1955. But by 1969, arrests had switched. They were 77% white and only 22% black. The next year, in 1970, although public punitivists had hit new highs at the time, Congress repealed the drug-related mandatory minimums and critiqued them, saying things like they hamper the process of rehabilitation, they infringe on proper judicial rules, they exacerbate problems of youth alienation, and they wrongly punish casual violators as if they were hardened criminals. This sounds familiar to us. Congressmen spoke to the arbitrariness of drug mandatory minimums. John Jarman said that drug addiction is a criminal offense, quote, only because we have made it one. Despite how outrageous it sounds, the opinions on punitive measures for narcotics flipped again. A decade and a half later, in 1984, 1986, and 1988, Congress passed mandatory drug penalties. Again, but this time the central punitive target was crack cocaine, which since 1910 had been referred to as, quote, Negro cocaine madness. And in 1993, African Americans represented 88.3% of all federal crack distribution convictions. As a more recent, quick example of the racialized lawmaking, I want to note that in 2007, 2 Louisiana cities passed indecency laws, punishable by jail time and fines for wearing, quote, saggy pants, a clothing laden undeniably with racial associations. So it's clear that the systemization of our laws did not actually promote, as Murakawa says, freedom from state-sanctioned racial violence. It merely promoted protection from lawless private violence by an enhanced, quote-unquote, neutral carceral state. And the carceral systematic state can easily perpetuate racial violence and retain its legitimacy as a state, as long as it abides by the laws and codes that it sets for itself. Thank you. So back to the Native American example. In light of progressive humanistic ideas that hinder outright domination, one could not simply dominate and slaughter a group of people. It hurts them, right? It falls outside of our definition of liberty. But if we do a slight maneuver, it might work. If we somehow construe that Native Americans pose a threat to my or society's liberty, if we construct someone as a criminal whose liberty then threatens my own, we then neatly justify another's incarceration, not only within but according to our own definition of liberty. Domination, control, colonization then no longer take the form of unjustified bloody encounters, but it takes the form of systematic criminalization of the other. the form of widening laws, of harsher sentences, or, to pull from recent events, leaking lead into poor communities, since lead is proven to have a direct correlation with juvenile delinquency, irrational behavior, and crime. As libertarians, we need not make liberty simple, easily packaged, and sellable. We need to ask uncomfortable questions, complex questions that make liberty active, living, breathing, and encompassing of all individuals. So I'll leave you with a few problematic questions. That's basically the basis for my own research. Do we, or to what extent do we have the right to deny others liberty, supposedly for the sake of our own? How can that implode through the ever-expanding definition of what is legal and what is illegal? Whose purpose does the fabrication of criminality serve? Who decides what actions are harmful to society? In what ways do classification of legal and illegal actions benefit those who create those classifications? And lastly, from the outset, Foucault says that prison reformation is doomed because the prison itself is established on failure. Since the 1800s, we have known prisons do not diminish crime rate. Detention causes recidivism. The prison cannot fail to produce delinquents. Prison makes possible and even encourages future criminal acts. The conditions to which free inmates are subjected condemn them to recidivism. And lastly, prison indirectly produces delinquents by throwing inmates' families into destitution. So why, when we've known since the 1800s that prison actually produces criminals rather than reforming them, do we continue to suggest prison reforms, continue to offer the prison as its own remedy? Thank you.